Welcome, everyone. My name is Adam Lang, and I am the head of Nesta in Scotland. It's my pleasure and my privilege to welcome you today to our Nesta Talks To event with Professor Shannon Vallor. Nesta Talks To is an informal conversation series which we've been running in recent months with today's most interesting thinkers focused on the big topics that are set to define and shape our futures across the UK and indeed globally. In an age of overabundance of information, it is at times hard to know how we make sense of the world around us and how we as citizens and individuals can play a part in shaping that world. To guide us towards some answers and almost certainly a lot more questions, we're talking to a series of leading thinkers, community builders, artists, social entrepreneurs who are working to understand the world around us and what our future may look like. Every month, the team across the UK are holding conversations to focus on an urgent topic or an issue of high importance, from mental well-being and equality to the climate crisis and the future of humanity. So before I introduce our speaker, Professor Vallor, today, I'd like to explain just a little bit about the format of today's session. We will be kicking things off with a chat for the first 30 minutes or so between myself and Professor Vallor, before opening that up to questions from all of you attendees in today's sessions. We're looking at least 100 or so participants so far, so that's really encouraging, and thank you all for joining us. I would encourage you all to type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen from the beginning as we go. There's a functionality there where people can upvote questions that go in there, so that helps us in terms of facilitating this to know what the questions that are really resonating with all of you are from an audience perspective. So today we'll be talking to Professor Shannon Vallor. Professor Vallor is Professor of Philosophy and the Baillie Gifford Chair in Ethics of Data and Artificial Intelligence at the University of Edinburgh's Edinburgh Futures Institute. And Professor Vallor is also the Director of the Centre for Techno-Moral Futures. We'll be finding out in just a moment about what those excellent job titles mean, because they're certainly fantastic to try and not get wrong when you're introducing someone. But firstly, let me say a very warm welcome to Professor Vallor and thank you for joining us today. So without further ado, we'll crack on, and may I start by asking Professor Vallor, could you please introduce yourself and your work that you lead on in your own words?
Sure, thanks Adam, and thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. So I am a philosopher who works in the area of ethics of emerging technologies. And for the last 10 to 15 years, I've been working on the ethics of social media, artificial intelligence, robotics, data science, basically looking at how new applications of technology transform our relationships with one another, transform our institutions. And in particular, my work tends to focus on how new technologies reshape our moral character, the kinds of moral habits and skills and capabilities that we develop together and exercise regularly and strengthen or allow to decline. And I think technologies play an important role in shaping those moral capabilities for better and for worse. And that's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. I came to Scotland relatively recently from the United States, where I've been working in the heart of Silicon Valley for many years, working not only as an academic, but working with government agencies, technology companies, practitioners in sciences and engineering to think about how to develop more sort of ethical reflection and critical insight in technology design and development and implementation. But I came to Scotland because the Edinburgh Futures Institute, which is where the Baillie Gifford Chair in Ethics of Data and AI sits, is a really new and incredible opportunity to bring multiple disciplines together to think about precisely these kinds of challenges. We've created a new Center for Techno-Moral Futures within the Institute that has specifically the mission of integrating technical and moral knowledge from the ground up in the process of designing, developing, implementing, using data-driven innovations. So the idea is rather than have ethics be something that kind of comes in after the technology is built and points out its risks or its flaws, and creates this relationship where there's critique, but not necessarily an engine of improvement. We really want to think about how we can design education systems and research habits so that technical intelligence and expertise and moral intelligence and expertise grow together and inform each other.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I think that there's so much at the moment in that space that at times can feel disconnected, you know, academia or business, governments and agencies. So it's really encouraging to hear you talk about that sort of starting principle of joining it up and from the ground up, building those values and those approaches into the work. Are you able to, and I have to say selfishly from my own understanding, are you able to give us an example of how you might see that working, either from something that's practical at the moment? I appreciate it's a very new centre, or something that you have sort of in the pipeline that you're able to share in terms of how you see that working, that ground up approach.
Sure, absolutely. So right now we have 5 fully funded PhD students coming in through fellowships paid for by the Baillie Gifford Gift to study specific challenges in the ethics of data and AI. Just to give you some examples, we have one student who's going to come in to work on a data ethics framework for agriculture, which is a really underdeveloped area. There's a lot of really important ethical issues going on in the agricultural data domain. We've got someone who's going to come in and look at the kinds of algorithms that are used to allocate scarce healthcare resources, and think about how relevant that is today in the era of COVID. We have someone coming in to look at the ethics of credit decisions in credit and lending in the finance sector, and how we can look at the ways in which those are determined to be fair or not, or more or less fair, or what kinds of fair. We have someone looking at the role of data in higher education. We have someone coming in to look at certain trends in social robotics, and some of the issues of representation and harm that can come through those designs. So we have a really broad range of projects, but they're all concrete. They're all dealing with real world challenges having to do with the kinds of technologies that are already here, not sort of speculative futures, but rather thinking about the futures that are already being built and how we shape those in ways that are more responsible, equitable, sustainable, and just. And that's the mission of the center. And all of the students that we have coming in are working from multiple disciplines. They have backgrounds in, you know, neuroscience, finance, biomedical ethics, philosophy, business, and law, and they're all coming in being supervised by experts from multiple disciplines and fields. So that's kind of reinforcing this idea that there is no one discipline or lens through which these problems can be solved. They really have to be solved with a comprehensive and integrative strategy.
Fantastic. Thank you for that description. It feels like a real moment in time for these issues from a Scotland perspective, but also globally. And I know that there's fantastic work going on in Edinburgh from your centre and others, the Global FinTech Hub, as well as work in Glasgow and life sciences. And as you allude to in terms of agriculture, these are big pressing issues for Scotland, the UK and globally. So it feels really exciting that these issues are being grappled with here and at this time. So obviously in advance of today, we did a sort of bit of homework and sort of had a look at some of the things that you've been active and vocal on in the recent past. And one of the things that recurs quite a lot in some of your recent work is this concept of the burden of a moral debt accumulated through design, development and use of technologies. And I think for us at Nesta, this is a concept that we found really exciting, really interesting, this idea of a moral debt. And I wondered if you could explain what you mean by this idea of a moral debt, technology's moral debt. How is it created? What is it? And what do you think the impacts of it are?
Sure, absolutely. So start with the idea that it takes a certain amount of moral labor to keep a society afloat, functional, reasonably stable, and healthy. It's moral labor because these are the kinds of things that have to be done to hold us in society, to maintain the will to live together, which can't be taken for granted. And that's true whether or not these things are mandated by law or favored by the politics of the day. If some level of this basic moral labor doesn't get done, either by the state or by private citizens, the social fabric starts to unravel and eventually falls apart if it's neglected long enough. So examples of what I mean by moral labor here, some of it involves social care for vulnerable members, children, the elderly, the sick, and so on. Every functional society that's sustainable has to have systems in place to achieve some level of social care of its vulnerable members. Some of it involves keeping things like infrastructure and basic goods and services accessible and ensuring a minimum level of public integrity and respect for the rule of law. Some of the moral labor involves maintaining and repairing civic bonds of trust and goodwill and cooperation between groups of citizens who have divergent values and interests. So think of societies as complex dynamic systems, kind of like biological ecosystems. There's some internal maintenance that has to go on to keep the system in equilibrium and resilient enough to survive external shocks and threats, whether that's a pandemic or climate change or some other kind of challenge. So we often think of many of these kinds of moral labors as political labor, as the job of governments. But I actually think that's a mistake. I think it's more accurate to describe it as moral labor, duties of basic social care that we often empower government bodies to perform on our behalf. So it's really the job that we do together to hold ourselves in society, and government is one very important mechanism for doing much of that work. But it's important to realize that that's still our work that's getting done. So here's the debt part. Sometimes we don't actually do the moral labor that needs to be done, and we let it pile up. And for a certain amount of time, a society can withstand that kind of deferred moral labor, that moral debt that builds up. But over time, it begins to put more and more strain and stress on the system. And what I'm arguing is that we've often, in recent decades, relied more and more on technology to either substitute for some of the moral labor that needs to get done, or worse, to defer it and kind of disguise the damage and delay that moral labor. So what I'm really looking at in a lot of my current research is how we can bring technology into a relationship with our moral labor such that it's helping us maintain and repair the bonds of social health, as opposed to allowing us to further defer that kind of maintenance, moral maintenance work of our social ties.
So this sounds, now possibly more topical than ever, if you like, because we're seeing in governments globally, across the UK and here at home in Scotland, we're seeing a big focus on these concepts of renewal, of rebuilding, whether it's, build back better or whatever the slogan is that applies wherever people might be based. But we're seeing a big emphasis on how do we emerge from the crisis that we're in just now and have an honest reflection on the shortcomings that this is exposed in whether it's in our social bonds or our public services or our interactions between the state and the private sector, and how do we grapple with some of those fundamentals at often structural level, as well as you sort of talk about in terms of a moral or an ethical approach to not repeat mistakes of the past. So in that context, a couple of sort of follow-on questions then for you. The first one, I suppose, is can you give an example of a system that we might recognise where technical and moral debts have been accumulated? Is there an example you could share there? And just related to that, when we think about these conversations about renewal, what to your mind is the thing that we have to grapple with first in that, through the prism of this issue of moral debt? Where's the starting principle for that renewal conversation from your perspective?
So let me start with the examples, and then I'll turn to your second question about how do we get started. So I think two examples that will be quite apparent. One is the massive moral debt that's been accruing in our elder care systems in many technologically advanced nations. We haven't thought enough about how to care well for an aging population, and we didn't invest early on enough in the training and economic changes needed to meet the needs of that population. Now, I remember learning, 30, 40 years ago that this aging population was coming and it was going to put a tremendous amount of strain on society. So it's not as if we didn't know that these challenges were coming. We had plenty of advance notice. But we deferred a lot of the moral labor that was needed to meet those needs. And in many cases, we just expected that somehow technology would be there to bail us out when those pressures really began to build up. And I think now we see what happens when that moral labor is delayed and there's an external shock to the system like COVID-19. You see it hit an elder care system that was already weakened and neglected and underfunded. And a cascading series of costly harms that has cost countless lives and suffering for the aged and their families, and left the system even more vulnerable to the next wave of shocks. So, if you think about technologies as part of that, we have, in many cases, imagined that, for example, robots would be here to supplement human labor and take care of the elderly when we didn't have enough human caregivers. Well, I remember researching what are these, are called care bots back in the early O's. And the projections were that they would be commercially available everywhere on the market and able to lift your loved ones out of bed and help them into the bathroom and give them their medications and alert you when they were ill, that all that would be here by now. But in fact, we do have some robots that are quite useful in this situation, but their capabilities are very, very limited compared to what was projected. And so often those technological hopes are unrealistic because we don't want to necessarily invest in the human care and the kinds of structural reforms that are needed to make sure that moral labor in society is done. And so I think we need to both be aggressive in thinking about technology as an essential tool in making sure that we meet our moral needs and obligations to one another. But we have to get out of this mindset of imagining that technology is simply the motor of social maintenance and progress. It's people that maintain societies. Another example, by the way, of this kind of moral debt, if you think about the way we've managed the pressures of growing energy consumption and waste production. And again, there's an example where we saw these challenges coming way in advance. We knew they were going to put critical pressures on our social systems, but we simply assumed that new energy technologies, new recycling technologies, that somehow science and technology would parachute in and save us from the responsibility to really meet these challenges head on. And that hasn't happened, certainly not in time to prevent, life-threatening heat waves and crop failures and famines and waves of climate refugees fleeing for survival. So we need to stop expecting science and technology to be a magic or silver bullet. And we need to start using these as extensions of our own moral and political will to solve the problems that face us. So I think we also have to recognize that moral debt accrues interest. It has an interesting parallel with something called technical debt in software systems. That's when you can take some shortcuts around documentation or user testing or validation before you deliver the software product, because you need to get it to the customer on time at the agreed upon price. So you don't do everything you could to make this system perfectly robust and perfectly reliable and resilient. And sometimes that's okay. I mean, no system can be perfect. But if you put too much technical debt into the system, then when the customer implements it, the chances of failure are unacceptably high, especially as it begins to interact with other weaknesses in the user environment or customer environment. And then those problems cost more to fix once they're out there in the world and having real cascading effects. So that's what we call interest in technical debt. It would have been cheaper to actually build the system to be robust in the first place than to have to fix it once it's already out in the world failing. Moral debt is the same way. The longer we defer attention to these needs in our society, the more it costs down the road to repair the damage. So we need to think about what is smart, what is efficient, what is expedient. It's not to always take the shortcut and delay. It's often to invest now so that you don't have to pay more in social pain and costs later. So the argument is that we need, in order to get that movement toward renewal that you spoke of moving forward, we need to have a kind of philosophical reorientation to how we think about society. We have to break this link that we make between innovation and progress, where we think that anything that is a new technology automatically drives social progress and automatically strengthens our societies. We've seen that technologies can strengthen and weaken us. They can make us more or less resilient as a society or as an institution. So we need to have a much more critical eye towards technological innovation. We need to demand the evidence that it will actually progress social flourishing and renewal and resilience in ways that are measurable beyond sort of short-term profitability and growth in things like GDP, which we know are no longer reliably coupled with social resilience and strength. Certainly not if you look at things like measures of sort of democratic health or the health of the information ecosystem, which we see as quite degraded at the moment. So that's what I think the first step is, to sort of step back and say, all right, we have to rethink the relationship between science, technology, and progress, and examine it with a much more critical and responsible approach.
So this is absolutely fascinating. It's the kind of thing that I wish we had hours and hours for. But there's a few things floating around in my head just on the back of what you've said there. I think, we're seeing a real welcome focus here in Scotland and many other places now on the concept of a well-being economy or a well-being society, which sounds to me like a great a coupling, if you like, between some of the issues you're talking about and a reframing of how we grapple with these as a society. I'm also thinking that one of the things that strikes me, the issues you're talking about take an enormous amount of bandwidth for institutions such as government or even the private sector. Certainly, the voluntary sector. We've got a very large, very active, very influential voluntary sector in Scotland that play a critical role in our society. And I'm just wondering, how do we bridge this challenge, which we see already in Scotland and in many other countries, play out, where there are people and there are institutions who know some of the things we need to grapple with, such as the issues you're talking about just now. But we struggle at times to bring these issues into the heart of the key decision-making forums. So I'm thinking government, for example, or private sector and industry. What's your reflections on that challenge and any views on where progress has been made in that regard, in terms of bringing these conversations into institutions which can at times struggle with the bandwidth? More often than not, they're trying to get through the week or the day. And how do we have these conversations for these much bigger, longer term, but critical issues? Yeah,
absolutely. And I don't have a magic solution, but I do have a couple of things that I think will help. First of all, I do think that you see in Scotland and in the government and policy sector a great will to not repeat some of the mistakes that we've seen be made in other implementations of, for example, algorithmic decision making or automation. And there is this, I think, kind of practical wisdom inherent in the orientation that we have here in Scotland to these things. As opposed to a sort of naive surrender to hype and empty promises. So I'm encouraged by that. But the bandwidth issue that you're raising is absolutely still, especially in the pandemic era, right? I mean, you're putting out the fires that have to be put out immediately, and that makes it harder to go back and do that sort of structural work. So one thing I think we can do is that government and technology developers need to open up new avenues of technological adoption to extensive public and expert examination, critique, and stress testing. So think about, for example, in England, the Ofqual mess with the A levels algorithm, and similar challenge in Scotland, of course. In the case of Ofqual, the things that ended up causing that algorithm to be rejected as a social failure were easily seen in advance. They were not very subtle or hidden things. And so had that process been opened up to extensive external inquiry and critique before it was implemented, there would have been a chance to pursue a path that would have been more broadly acceptable and less damaging both to public trust in government and public trust in the technology itself. But often governments don't want to expose their plans to that level of transparent review and stress testing because, for lots of reasons, it doesn't seem efficient. There's always critics. People will pick apart any proposed solution that you offer. But as a government agency, taking on that criticism and then explaining why you've chosen the tool or the policy that you have is much better than acting first without consultation to alert you to the risks and then having to explain yourself later. So I think one thing we can do from a government standpoint is just take on that role of some humility and some openness and transparency, both with the general public and with experts who have a particular set of skills and knowledge that they can use to help alert us in advance to the limitations of a particular technology or a particular algorithm. So I think no technology, no algorithm is perfect, but we need to be confident that we can know and articulate how it's imperfect and why it's the best among all available alternatives before we bet people's futures on it. And I think if government gets in the habit of opening itself to those kinds of critical conversations, then the public has the opportunity to see itself as doing part of that moral work in society in partnership with government, as opposed to having to be passive and reactive and responding to either, yes, I like what the government is doing, or no, I don't, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's really important. And I think we also need to recognize that private corporations also have some role to play here. And in particular, they need to recognize that unless they reform some of their own incentives to be more aligned with sort of long-term public interests and social health, then they are sort of sawing off the branches on which they sit. So private companies need to work much more collaboratively with government. Frankly, they need to embrace, tax conditions and regulatory conditions that are reasonable and fair, and not simply allow a kind of race to the bottom or lowest bidder scenario where societies are deprived and governments are deprived of the resources they need in order to implement technologies in ways that are safe and responsible and well tested and audited. So I think we need a reorientation also within industry towards a sort of long-term strategy of designing technology for the public interest, because we already see public faith in science and technology declining. That's a very bad sign. And the more that we continue to neglect these ethical issues in the way technologies are designed and developed, the more people will lose the belief that human innovation is actually a road to progress and a way to repair and renew our systems. So I'm someone who loves technology, loves science, and I want to see it continue to be a part of the human story of progress and renewal.
There's so much in there. I think that's a fantastic answer on so many fronts. I was reminded as you were chatting there about a former colleague of mine who talked about the value of humble governments and porous governments. And I'm struck by that in terms of your response there, and how at times we struggle with that, I think, across the UK, not just Scotland, not just England, across the UK and indeed globally. I think it's easy to say we want to have an open government, we want to, be humble, but it's hard at times when there's issues of risk, when there's issues of electoral accountability, and et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely.
So one of the things I'm interested in, you talked really articulately there about the private sector and the role of government and the need for them to be much more open, much more humble in a way with their work in longer term. One of the things that you touched on, but I'm keen to just chat a little bit more about, is the role of the citizen in that space. And the reason I ask in particular is at Nesta in Scotland, just a couple of months ago, we published some research which was a sort of a deep dive into public attitudes in Scotland towards the technologies of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And in some ways, many of the findings would not in any way be surprising. It's sort of quite consistent with things that have been documented, but it was really useful to get a dive into that from a Scotland-specific perspective. And one of the things that emerged is big gaps by socioeconomic status, by gender, by income, between people's knowledge, familiarity, and comfortableness with these technologies like AI, cloud computing, data, etc., and how comfortable they felt about the role these technologies are playing currently and will play in the future. And I just wondered, I'm not specific about that research, but in a general sense, I'm sure this is something that comes up a lot, that, right, these different experiences from different social economic groups and different genders, etc., in society. What examples have you seen of where this is done well, of where trying to bridge these gaps is done in a proactive way, taking on board all the points you mentioned before? Where could we look to globally to sort of get good examples of how governments and private sector are trying to grapple with the challenges of technology? Because it's complex, it's fast-paced, it's moving at a rate that traditional institutions struggle to keep up with. So who's leading the way on this in terms of bringing the citizen in as well? Is there anyone, or are we all grappling with this?
I think everyone's grappling with it to a degree, but there are definitely some bright lights and sort of experiments that have been tried that suggest ways forward. Many people, for example, have talked about Estonia's development of a sort of what a kind of pioneering move towards a digital government where citizens are really provided the resources and expertise needed to manage online interfaces with pretty much all public services and so forth. But that doesn't fit every model, and you can't do that until you have the technological infrastructure to give everybody broadband and everybody what they need. So I think there is no one-size-fits-all solution. I think each region and government has to think about its people and their capabilities and resources and figure out where those can be met. I think Scotland is doing a great job of investing in, for example, the democratization of data skills and sort of bringing those more broadly across the population. But one of the things I want to encourage is we don't want to move into the illusion that those who are most technically and scientifically proficient and knowledgeable in the narrow sense about these technologies always understand better the risks and benefits and impact on human existence. So what I'm thinking about is there are a lot of people who may not think of themselves as data literate or know much about AI, who might live in relatively remote parts of Scotland that have relatively spotty Wi-Fi or broadband access. They may or may not be proficient with smartphones and the like, but they may have experiences of how hard it is, for example, to access a specific public service on a website, or how difficult it is to get help from an agency that has really presupposed a certain level of technical sophistication and capability among citizens prematurely. So what I'm trying to say is I think we also have to listen to the knowledge of people who aren't data literate or trained up yet on how to think about the role of AI or algorithmic decision making, but nevertheless have a tremendous amount of knowledge about what works and what doesn't work with technology in the public sphere. So I think we need to think about knowledge that needs to go both ways. That is, we need more scientific and technical expertise and capability around data and AI and other technologies to flow into the public and sort of citizen sphere. But we also need to make sure that that knowledge of what people need, what people want, is coming back into the domains where those technologies are being built and designed, because I see many failures that come from technologists not listening to people and citizens, not asking questions about what their needs actually are and what systems actually work for them.
I think it's an excellent point, and I know many colleagues here in Scotland would echo exactly what you're saying, and there's a big push at the moment that I know around what's called the Scottish approach to service design, which is trying to enhance service design principles with some of the stuff around citizen engagement, citizen participation, as we look at services. But I think your point is really well made there.
Can I just add one last point?
Of course, yes.
I do think one thing we need to work on, though, is strengthening the habits and capabilities of public deliberation by citizens, the capacity of citizens to actually collaboratively solve problems and help governments make decisions. Because I think one of the things we've seen with, especially with sort of the effect of the internet on the digital public sphere, is that a lot of our political and democratic capabilities have declined into, forms of debate and discussion that aren't actually constructive. So some of my research is thinking about how do we rehabilitate some of those skills of democratic deliberation by citizens, because a lot of those have been damaged by online environments where we're really habituated not to participate constructively, but rather just to try to attack one another or engage in ways that draw attention, but not necessarily move towards solutions.
Absolutely, and from my 2 cents, I completely agree. I think at Nesta, we do a lot of work around what we call participatory futures, in terms of how we can bring citizens together to help shape and inform those conversations. And I'm always struck when I have these conversations with people. A friend of mine, a former colleague, a man called Ewan Aitken here in Scotland, who's the chief executive of a charity called Serenians, he talks really eloquently about how in the last decade in Scotland, we have lost the physical spaces for people to come together and disagree.
Yeah.
And he talks much more eloquently than I ever could about that concept. But I think it's so important when we think about the fabric of our society and the type of society we want to be. We have to have those spaces where we come out of our tribes and we come together and we can disagree collectively, or at least in part anyway.
Disagree and then move past disagreement towards actions and
exactly
and solutions that don't please everybody, but that are acceptable as a civic body. And yeah, I think we've, especially in online spaces, we can get to disagreement, but getting past that has become almost impossible.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, Shannon, thank you very much for that. We've had a few questions from participants here in the Q&A, which I will try and turn to now. I apologise to everyone watching in advance if we're not able to get through your question. We will do our best to try and get through as many as we can. The first one that I'm going to come to is from Jeremy Knox, who asks, there's been a plethora of ethical guidelines published in very recent years for data-driven technologies such as AI from governments and industry. Is the very idea of a guideline or a framework enough to solve the ethical issues? If not, what are some of the key things that these guidelines are missing? Great question.
Great question. So you won't be surprised to hear the answer is no, they're definitely not sufficient to solve the problem. We know that. And I think, the skepticism around some of these principles is understandable, but I think it's also important to recognize that they do play a partial role. What principles of this kind do is provide a kind of benchmark that an organization or institution can be held accountable to. So for example, if you say transparency is one of your principles, that's just a starting point. That doesn't do anything to put that on a website or in a white paper or policy paper. But it does mean that your constituents or your employees or your customers or your citizens now should be able to come to you and say, what are the things that you have done to institute transparency? This is one of your principles. I want the story of what are the actions, what are the measures of transparency that you can give us. So it's a way for, principles are a way for an organization to set itself ethical aims that it then shares outside of itself and says, these are the things to which we can be held accountable. What we have to do then is the work to actually provide those measures of progress that allow that accountability to be met. So when I work with organizations, the principles are just the very first thing. And because applying those principles is the hard part. Everyone loves fairness. Everyone loves transparency. Everyone loves accountability. Everyone thinks justice is good, right? That's the easy part. But what that looks like with a particular set of citizens and a particular algorithm or a particular data collection challenge, that's the hard part. And so you need the skills to actually implement the principles and apply them and interpret them in a way that is sufficiently open to criticism, that is sufficiently responsive to people's needs, and that understands the landscape of risks and benefits and harms that's relevant to that particular technology in the hands of this particular kind of social group or community. So that's much harder work. But the principles are how we start, and they're the things that people can come back to again and again and say, show us how you have met this commitment that you've made.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. And I know that versions of those conversations are playing out actively here in Scotland now, for example, in the AI strategy steering group, which I know you're part of as well, and many other forums. I think they're absolutely bang on. A question here from Soledad. I apologize if I'm pronouncing that name wrong. Negotiations with tech industry depend on each country or region's power. How can we assure that so-called global south countries are equally included and heard in these discussions? Another great question.
That's a fantastic question. And there's a lot of great work that I've just seen start to come out in the past year or so on what's called sort of critical approaches to data colonialism or algorithmic colonialism, which there's a paper from a group of DeepMind researchers, interestingly enough, on decolonial AI, and the idea of thinking about how we recognize the way in which conversations, even about ethics in technology, have been dominated by the global north and by a relatively sort of elite, highly educated group of scholars in the global north that don't represent humanity and don't have the knowledge of the unique conditions of different parts of the world and the needs there that have to be met. So this is, I think, a move that I'm seeing being made in the research community, which I then hope will translate into different practices in sort of policy and government approaches as well. To not see these challenges as something to be responded to by a strictly European or North American or UK body of experts, but something that actually recognizes where the impact actually is happening, who is being affected, and gives priority to the voices and knowledge of those communities. So we see, for example, in the global south, examples where sort of algorithmic commercialization of certain public institutions and resources is already moving forward aggressively. And if we're not engaging in giving voice to the people who are going to be most impacted by those changes, then we're simply going to repeat the mistakes of the past again.
Yeah, thank you for that. The question here next on my list from Douglas Maxwell. I know Douglas, thanks for joining us. While Estonia is held up as an example of a digitally connected society in health, voting, civic participation, etc., and is one of the most technically progressed societies, it would be interesting to hear Shannon's views on if Estonia has more or less moral debt than, say, Scotland or the USA. So a bit of a subjective question there, but just any reflections on that?
I'm going to have to defer to someone with more expertise on the state of public life in Estonia. I use them as an example of how you can approach the idea of bringing people with you into a transition to a digital society or a digital government, as opposed to creating it and then expecting other people to somehow scramble to find the capabilities to come to those websites or come to those technological capabilities. So I am impressed with Estonia's sort of pioneering approach to making sure that the whole community is brought up to a level of digital capability before those services are then sort of transitioned into that mode. But in terms of its broader measures of social health and moral health as a community, I don't have the expertise to comment on that. But I do think that in Scotland, there is here an advantage. Scotland has a long history of sort of pragmatism in a kind of moral and political pragmatism, or sort of common sense philosophy, and a recognition, I think, that government is something that requires cooperation and requires sacrifice and requires a kind of critical approach to reasoning together that we need to draw upon. So I think while there are moral debts that we have, I think we might also have some moral surplus to draw from, if you will, or some stores that we can draw on to sort of reinvigorate the will to work together towards these kinds of solutions.
I agree with you very much there. My colleagues and I talk often about the low tolerance for bullshit in Scotland that makes sort of grappling with some of these things grounded very much in reality and pragmatism. And I think it's something we should never take for granted here. It's a real asset.
Was one of my reasons for moving here.
Excellent. That and the whiskey, of course.
And the whiskey.
Yeah. So we've got a question here, which might be the last one we've got time to get to, I'm afraid. A question from Judith. How do you reconcile the need for this idea of participative democratic deliberation that we highlight with current governance structures that seem to be designed explicitly to exclude the public from decision-making processes, or that replace real participation with quote-unquote participation theatre that has no real impact on the decisions? So again, it is a subjective question, but this balance about the tokenism of participation versus the real and meaningful stuff that can help shape and inform better technology and better approaches.
Yeah, I think that's where the lion's share of work needs to be done. And this is an example where I don't see many models elsewhere that are working very well right now in terms of public participation that is robust, that is constructive, and that makes citizens really feel as if they are part of the governing process, as opposed to this notion of political theater or giving inputs that then never come back with responses, right? One of the primary mechanisms of trying to get public involvement is to do sort of an open consultation where we say, tell us what you think. And then you get back this very general, well, this is what we heard from you. But it rarely feels like any specific citizen is listened to in that particular exchange, and everything just kind of gets mashed together. And then you wonder, well, is this just what the government was going to do anyway? And so we need more sort of, these are the things we heard. These are the people we heard. These are the experiences and backgrounds of the people that told us this. And here's how we responded to that. And here's a second chance to tell us what you think about this response and the way we think we're going to approach this particular challenge or problem that you've highlighted. So you need that kind of reciprocity to be built in. And frankly, I think we simply need new spaces and new norms to build for that. The existing models of governance don't meet that need. The kinds of digital environments we have, Facebook, Twitter, those aren't set up for this. So one of the things I'm really excited about is the possibility of creating new kinds of democratic spaces with a combination of physical and digital environments. Because I simply think we don't yet have those mechanisms in place.
Yeah, I think great answer. We talk a lot at work about the concepts of digital commons or data commons and this idea of new spaces, new approaches. So yeah, it resonates really well with a lot of the things we're grappling with. We're nearing the end of our time, Shannon. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative, if I may, just to ask you a final question before we wrap up. It's a question that I've heard asked within Nesta before, and I really like it because I think it's a bit unusual and a bit of a different way to end things out on. But if I can ask you, what's the question that you have not been asked today that you would love to answer? And give us your answer as well, if you will. But is there a question that's you've either today or in other sessions you've not been asked that you really want to answer? What would that be, and what would the answer be?
That's a really good one. So I'm going to answer a question that I do get asked quite often, not today, but I also think it's a question that I'm usually asked in the wrong way. So the question is usually, so are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of society and the future of technology and social progress? Do you think the future 50 years from now is going to be better or worse than the world that we're in today? And I always think the way that's framed is misleading, because it makes it sound as if I'm being asked to guess what that outcome will be, as if that outcome is somehow already determined, right? So if I'm an optimist, I'm placing my bets that it's the good future that's waiting out there for us. And if I'm a pessimist, I'm placing my bet that it's a further degraded society or way of life that's waiting for us. But that is the wrong way to look at it entirely. The future is unwritten. And the future is in our hands. And for me to be optimistic or pessimistic is utterly irrelevant, because the question is, what's the work that we're going to do to get to the future that we want? It's there. It can be built together. But to imagine that there's already some way of guessing forward towards whether that work gets done, I think takes our responsibility off the hook. We have to do that work. If we don't do the work, the future will not be one that we will welcome. But nothing determines that future except what we do today. So I always try to answer that question by saying, don't worry about that future. That future isn't written yet. Start writing it today.
I think that's an absolutely fantastic sentiment for us to close off this session on. I could not agree more with that sentiment. Thank you very much, Professor Vallor, for joining us today. I know that you've joined us at a time when universities are returning in very unusual circumstances. I know you're a very busy person generally. I'm incredibly grateful for your time and for chatting to us and all the folk that have joined us. I would encourage everyone who's a participant today to please follow Professor Vallor on social media and on the various websites for EFI and the Technomoral Futures as well. There's really cutting edge, phenomenal work going on there. and it's something we should be very proud of that is here in Scotland with us. So do follow that for all the updates there. Thank you to everyone for joining us, for the excellent questions that were posted. I apologise if we weren't able to get to your question and get it answered. Please do subscribe as well to our Nesta Scotland newsletter, where we'll be keeping you updated with all of our latest work and all the future of these events here in Scotland and across the UK. Our next Nesta Talks To event, we have Professor Paul Ramchandani from LEGO, who is their Professor of Play and also at the University of Cambridge, and we'll be chatting to Paul about play in early childhood and how that can influence positive life outcomes. So that's on Tuesday, the 20th of October, and I really hope that we'll all be sent Lego in advance of that, but I suspect not. But that would be my dream scenario, to just play with some Lego for a while. But I'll close off today by just thanking everyone again, and particularly Professor Vallor for your time. Thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.